Good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me. Not so sure about this live thing. Being a perfectionist, I don't necessarily like the thought of not being able to edit videos. But for you, we'll continue. Well, this morning we are going to be looking at the Bible study in the May edition of the Gather magazine. And as Pastor Andy and Rosine mentioned last month, there is a live chat function on the live stream. So if you have any comments or questions, you can type those in and send those to everybody. And there will be some questions that I'll ask, and those questions are for you. You can answer those in the live chat if you'd like, but otherwise, if you just want to contemplate those questions, that's okay too. So our Bible study this morning is called Plenty Good Room, and it's written by Angela T. Kabeb, who serves as the pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. And this is a great topic. I think we all have experience with good hospitality and with bad hospitality. We know folks in our lives who seem to have a natural gift or skill for hospitality, but we also know that it's a gift and a skill that we can develop in ourselves. For me, it doesn't happen to be one of my strengths, but I've also had the opportunity to work on those gifts and skills of hospitality, and we all have that opportunity. So as I was reading through this to prepare for today, I was thinking about my time working at summer camp, and my my mentor and boss, Sarah, the director of the camp that I worked at, always talked about hospitalizing the folks, hospitalizing the face-off of the folks who are coming to participate at camp. And so camp being a place where lots of folks come, and we of all ages, and we got to develop relationships with folks. I started to make that connection between the fact that hospitality is the front line for building relationships. If you experience bad hospitality, the chances that you're going to have a good relationship with that being your first impression goes way down. And so we have that opportunity as we're called in our lives of faith to build relationships and participate in relationships and be in relationship with one another and with God for the sake of relationships, and the fact that our relationships are not don't have any strings attached. Hospitality being the first step in those in that goal of building relationships with one another and with God. It's an important topic for us to talk about in our lives of faith. So we'll jump in. There's quite a few Bible verses that the author of the Bible study brings up for us to take a look at, and in the context of hospitality. So to begin with, if you have your Gather magazine, you can see that the author begins with a conversation about the old African American spiritual Plenty Good Room, speaking to the inclusivity that so many people yearn to know in the body of Christ. And as we continue there's some other resources that, as I was looking at this topic, I will share in the live chat so you can take a look at. So some of the questions for us to begin to ponder that the author has brought up. The first one is, does our congregation's welcome extend to those who are beyond our usual expectations, and what might some of those usual expectations be? So that's a question for us to ponder as we look at our first Bible verse. Another question is, how does our congregation's welcome unfold in our communities in real time? And when we say all are welcome, does that include people who don't look, talk, vote like the majority of the congregation members? And what about those who don't share our values or worldview? So those questions are questions that we can ponder as we look at Luke 24, 13 through 35. And I'll read that if you want to follow along. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told them what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. So one of those resources that I want to share with you, I will post right now in the chat, and hopefully you can follow the link there. And this is from the Blandin Foundation, looking at how folks have viewed both the changing landscape of rural Minnesota, as well as how they see their communities as welcoming or non-welcoming places. So one of the things that I found really interesting was that as diversity grows within our communities, there, as you can see, if you follow that link, the rural Minnesotans, the population has become more diverse over the past 5 years. So they were looking at all the way from 1998 to 2016 when they had this survey that they gave people all over Minnesota, that the diversity has grown, especially in rural areas. They also found that from 2010 to 2016, the questions surrounding whether people felt that their communities were a welcoming place for people of all backgrounds, that number had gone down. So in 2010, 78% of people felt like their community was a welcoming place for people of all backgrounds. In 2013, it was 82%, but in 2016, the number of folks who somewhat or strongly agreed that their community was a welcoming place for people of all backgrounds was 71%. So I don't know what your experience has been like viewing the changes throughout the years of the diversity, and whether that has affected the way you think about community as a welcoming place. But in the story from Luke 24, some of the questions that the author raises are: what might have kept the disciples from recognizing Jesus on the road to Emmaus? What distracts us from recognizing Jesus in our lives and in the world around us? And in light of the information from the Blandin Foundation, it makes me think about, do we see the face of Jesus in people who are only like us, or do we see the face of Jesus in the whole diversity of creation that God has created? So might one of those things that distracts us from recognizing Jesus be the differences in people that sometimes makes it harder for us, but no less important for us to recognize Jesus in the face of people who are both like us and people that we perceive as different from us, who come from different backgrounds. Another question that the author raises is what can we learn from the disciples' interaction with a stranger who they did not seem to seem to understand their pain? So have there been experiences in our own lives where we have interacted with people who didn't seem to understand where we were coming from, and how does that play into the distractions from that first question, from people who we may think are not also recognizing Jesus in us and in other people? One of the things I find most fascinating about the story in Luke 24, as it has to do with the topic of hospitality, is that it could stay. It could have just stated that that the hospitality is only seen through Jesus breaking the bread, but there's also an aspect in this story where the two disciples offer hospitality to Jesus, even though they don't know that it's Jesus. They think he's a stranger, but when he's about to walk on to the next village, they ask him to stay with them, and to eat with them, and then it's Jesus who breaks the bread, and they see that it's Jesus. So that so how do we see Jesus in hospitality? And Olivia's giving me a cup. So that's a form of hospitality. Thank you, Olivia. The next Bible verse is a very short one. It comes from Hebrews, but if you want to look it up along with me, I'll read it. But it comes from the book of Hebrews, verse 13, verses 1 and 2. And it says, "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it." And
Okay, Olivia, show it to mommy. Come here, star. Sorry, everybody.
So you can see, you're welcome into my home, and this is a hospitality that I have for you this morning. So, in Hebrews, this
is there a camera show?
This story that the author shares is of a young man named Shane who is experiencing housing insecurity and has stopped into her office unannounced, and she talks to Shane over coffee and cookies, and that relationship is built over the hospitality that they're both able to share. It's interesting to think about how hospitality comes with, with space. So obviously, it's easier to be hospitable, possibly when we're comfortable in a space and we're welcoming people into a space that we're already feel some sort of ownership over, but there's an aspect of hospitality that goes both ways. And the questions for this reading that the author lifts up is that our definition of angels too narrow, and how will we recognize the angels that live, walk, and dwell among us? And what might entertaining angels without knowing it look like in our context? And can you think of a time when you interacted with angels incognito? And finally, what might help us recognize God's activity in the world around us? This reading from Hebrews reminds me of the story in Genesis 18 of the hospitality that Abraham and Sarah give to strangers who end up being angels, or it's kind of vague, but might be they might be interacting with God directly, but through these three people who show up looking for rest in the hot desert, and Abraham and Sarah supply them with food and water. Something that's interesting about the word angel by itself is that the Greek angelos literally means messenger, and so when we're thinking about how we might define angels and how we might be entertaining angels unaware, that perhaps the people who are messengers of God's grace or love, they might be unaware of it, but how we might be able to recognize God's message through folks. So, I'm going to move on. I know that Psalm 23 is a favorite of folks. I'm going to skip over reading those verses for now. I encourage you to read them on your own. Psalm 23 and the questions that go along with that psalm are who has shown you godly hospitality when you were experiencing a difficult time? And what do we learn about God's hospitable acts in Psalm 23? And when did you accompany someone through their darkest valley? And when have you experienced a time of overflowing welcome? So great questions in the whole context of hospitality, especially when you look at Psalm 23. But we're going to move on to Luke 23, verses 32 through 43. Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Here was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanging there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So in the context of the topic of hospitality, these verses set up an interesting tension between the hospitality or non-hospitality that the soldiers and the leaders and even one of the men who died on the cross next to Jesus are giving to Jesus as he dies. What strikes me is that sour wine that they offer Jesus. And Jesus' response is to, of course, say, forgive them and recognize that they don't know what they're doing. But then at the end of those verses, to welcome the other criminal who dies next to Jesus by saying that today he will be in paradise. That tension between the way that Jesus welcomes the other man who's dying on the cross and the way that all of the people are treating Jesus during this lowest point in his life makes me think about ways in which people can use hospitality in a negative way, or can hold hospitality over other people. I don't know if you've ever experienced that before, but people who have given things to other people or have welcomed people and then use that as sort of that a way of asking for something in return. And as I talked about at the beginning of the Bible study here, how hospitality is really a call um, into relationship as the front line of our relationships, being hospitable to others, and that those relationships that we're called into don't have um, strings attached, just like the relationship that God has with us. It is a relationship for relationship's sake. And so the questions that the author asks here in the Bible study in our Gather magazine for this reading kind of have us think about that. What does the crucifixion teach us about power? And name the examples of power, negative or positive, seen here. How does Jesus seem to define or redefine power? And which power is the greatest and why? And the question, what does it mean that we receive the proclamation of the Messiah from this criminal? Some interesting questions for us to ponder as we think about Luke 23 and the verses that we just read. And that idea of the power, do we use hospitality? How do we use the power of our hospitality? The power that we see in these verses come through the weakness or perceived weakness of Jesus dying on the cross, which happens to be the most powerful thing that exists. But we see it as weakness, and the world sees it as weakness. And sometimes hospitality can be seen as weakness and can be taken advantage of. So, of course, there's always an aspect of self-care and making sure that we're not being taken advantage of. But at the same time, hospitality includes the need for us to be patient and to have empathy and to put ourselves in the shoes of a stranger who's coming into a space that's not their own, and how do we help folks feel welcome, and what vulnerability is there on our part that needs to take place inside of our hospitality. Sorry, I'm getting so many phone calls this morning that it's I'm gonna end this stream here, and